There are evenings in Oxford when even the rain appears to behave, reluctant, polite, uncertain whether it ought to disturb the calm of centuries. That night it fell softly, gathering in silver skeins along St. Giles, touching the windows of the King's Arms like a courteous hand before withdrawing. I'd gone there, as I sometimes did when the case files grew too tangled for the tidy logic they demanded. The pub was half empty, though the air retained that faint human warmth that lingers after laughter. Someone had been telling stories earlier. One could feel it still, like perfume that won't quite leave a room. I took my usual corner, near the window that looked out onto the rain-slick street. There was a glass left on the table opposite. Half a measure of white wine, its rim smudged, the condensation catching the light like the trace of breath on a mirror. The landlord, a man with the unfortunate name of Biddle, noticed me noticing. He came over with his slow, habitual shuffle and said she'd been in every Thursday for months, always the same table, always the same drink. Then, as if reluctant to gossip but unable not to, he added that she hadn't been seen for a fortnight now. He had chalked something above the bar earlier that evening, some sentimental line from a student perhaps, a toast to the absent lover. I remember it because the handwriting was too neat for sentiment, and because it seemed to unsettle me without reason. I found that the smallest details, handwriting, word choice, the temperature of a forgotten glass, often do. They speak in undertones to some part of me I'd rather ignore. Biddle cleared away the wine and asked if I wanted my usual. I told him I'd take a scotch, no ice. He nodded with the gravity of a man performing a minor sacrament. While he poured, I looked again at the place where she'd been sitting. The outline of her damp coat was still visible on the chair's fabric, darkened by the weeks of absence. Strange how the residue of people lasts longer than their presence. When he returned, I asked, casually, as one might inquire after a misplaced umbrella, whether she'd said she was going away. He thought for a moment, polishing a glass. Said she'd mentioned London once, something about lectures, but that she'd left a notebook behind. A small one, blue cover, neat handwriting. He'd meant to keep it safe in case she returned. I asked to see it. The notebook was unremarkable at first glance. The sort of thing one might buy from Blackwell's without thinking. Yet when I opened it, I saw the pages filled with Latin quotations, fragments from Ovid and Virgil, each written in 2 columns as though she were translating herself from one language into another. And in the margins, a single word repeated more than once, written in blue ink rather than black. Absence. Absent. I told Biddle I'd leave a note in case she came back for it. He nodded again, distracted now by a dripping tap, but I didn't write the note. Instead, I finished my drink, listening to the rain gather strength, and felt a curious ache settle somewhere between curiosity and regret. There was nothing yet to investigate. No crime, no witness, not even a name. Only a woman who wrote in 2 languages and stopped coming to the pub where she always sat. Yet something in the balance of that half-finished glass, in the word absence, repeated like an incantation, began to trouble the corners of my mind. When I left, the chalkboard above the bar gleamed faintly in the lamplight. The words were running slightly now, the chalk turning to a pale blur under the damp air, a toast to the absent lover. I paused at the door, reluctant to go back into the rain, and thought, not for the first time, how absence has its own peculiar weight, sometimes heavier than presence, sometimes almost enough to drown in. It was Lewis who brought me the letter. He had that expression, half baffled, half apologetic, which usually meant something curious had found its way through the bureaucratic filter of the Thames Valley Police. He set it down on my desk as though it might stain the wood. A plain white envelope addressed in a woman's hand. To the police, Oxford. There was no return address. Only that faintly old-fashioned courtesy in the handwriting. The kind that belongs to people who still believe in stationery and deliberate sentences. Inside, a single page. Typewritten. The sort of machine that strikes too hard on the vowels. The woman at the King's Arms did not go to London. She never left Oxford. No greeting, no signature, not even a date. Just that. A quiet accusation disguised as a statement of fact. Lewis said it had come through the central mailroom that morning, probably from one of the colleges. I asked which. He didn't know. The postmark was blurred. A trick of the rain, perhaps. The sort of smudging that makes you think the weather conspires with human deceit. I read the line again, slowly this time, letting the rhythm of it work through me. The woman at the King's Arms. Not a woman, the definite, precise, familiar. I thought again of the half-finished glass, the smudge of lipstick, the faint perfume that had outlasted her presence. And then that word. Never. A word that leaves no room for the ordinary departures of life. Lewis asked if it was worth looking into. I told him that all mysteries begin in small ways. Sometimes with a corpse, sometimes with a crossword clue, sometimes, as now, with an unsigned letter that knows more than it should. He muttered something about wasting time, about pranksters and bored undergraduates. I didn't blame him. Most days I agreed. But that evening, long after Lewis had gone, I found myself walking toward Somerville. There was nothing official to justify the visit, only the intuition that the letter had come from there, the tone of a certain kind of educated conscience, unwilling to remain, silent but too frightened to speak plainly. The gates were half closed, and the porter eyed me with a faint suspicion reserved for men who arrive at colleges after dusk. He said there had been no trouble, though his tone betrayed curiosity. When I mentioned the name Eleanor Fielding, a guess, but one born from the notebook Biddle had shown me. He hesitated, then nodded. Said she'd been away on leave, but that no one had heard from her since Michaelmas began. The college had assumed she'd gone to London, research or conferences, or one of those academic disappearances that attract no concern until they last too long. He said her rooms were locked. Regulations. I said I quite understood. Then, while he took a phone call, I noted the brass nameplate beside her door on the ground-floor corridor. E. Fielding, Classics. A faint dusting of chalk marked the edge. Someone had recently written and wiped something away. I couldn't tell what, though a letter A was still visible under the sheen of polish. Perhaps the start of absence. My imagination has never needed much encouragement. Back outside, the quadrangle was empty except for the rain and the dark stains it left on the stone. I stood a moment beneath the archway, listening to the slow dripping of the gutters, that small, steady rhythm that makes the night feel watchful. The letter was in my coat pocket, folded twice. I thought of the person who had written it, their fingers pausing above the keys, wondering whether to send it, whether to intervene. And I wondered too. Not for the first time, I found myself thinking how every disappearance begins the same way. Not with absence, but with indifference. The space someone leaves behind only acquires meaning once another person decides to notice it. As I walked back toward St. Giles, the spires shrouded in mist, I tried to remember when I had last believed that people simply go away. But Oxford teaches one thing above all others, that nothing vanishes without leaving a trace. Not words, not love, not guilt. The letter, still damp from my hands, felt heavier than paper ought to feel. I've always distrusted the color blue. It has too much memory in it. The sky, the sea, the veins beneath the wrist. The ink in Eleanor Fielding's notebook was of that same shade, a blue that seemed not written but bruised onto the paper. Lewis had found her name, finally. A routine check at Somerville, a polite conversation with the college secretary, a mention of a classics lecturer on sabbatical who had recently, and rather quietly, vanished from view. The pieces had begun to fit together in a way I never entirely trusted. Life is rarely so obliging. When I first saw her room, it reminded me of a cell more than a study. The air held the dry calm of a place left untended, though nothing was disordered. Books stood in obedient rows. A small kettle waited on the windowsill beside an unopened jar of honey. On the desk lay the blue notebook. Biddle had shown me, its twin perhaps, or continuation. The same narrow handwriting, the same ink that sank slightly into the fibers of the page as though it were trying to hide inside them. Lewis asked if we should open the drawers. I told him yes, but carefully, as if the past might resent disturbance. He frowned in that practical way of his, meaning that I was being needlessly poetic again. Inside we found a few letters, all written in the same precise hand, though the paper varied. Some typed, others handwritten. The signatures were absent, torn away. But one had a small stain in the corner. Wine, perhaps, or blood diluted by time. She had written translations in the notebook, passages from Ovid's Heroides, letters between mythic lovers parted by distance and fate. The margins were crowded with notes in blue ink, single words, fragments of thought, Latin terms for deceit and absence. Falsus, absens, mutus, false, absent, silent. Lewis said it looked like a student's exercise. I said it looked like confession. On the mantelpiece stood a framed photograph, Eleanor with another woman, younger, smiling awkwardly into the light. Behind them, the faint shadow of a man, blurred by the camera's focus. Only half his face was visible, but the mouth, that careful, self-satisfied line, was not the mouth of a student. When I asked the porter later, he said Dr. Michael Garston used to visit from the English faculty, always on Thursdays. The same night, I remembered, that she had sat at the King's Arms. The pattern began to emerge, delicate as frost. Back in my office, I read the notebook again under the lamplight. My eyes caught on a curious detail. On every page where she had written in blue ink, the nib had pressed slightly harder into the paper, as if she'd been trying to force permanence through pressure, a woman trying to ensure she could not be erased. There was a crossword folded inside the back cover, the Times from a fortnight earlier. Most clues solved in neat, sure lettering. Only one left blank. Absent lover returns. Concealing lie. 6. I found myself filling it in without thinking. Falsus. The same word she'd written again and again. False. Lewis knocked, asked if I was staying late. I told him I might, though I didn't say why. The truth was that the case, if it was yet a case, had already lodged itself somewhere in the mind's quieter corridors. That blue ink, that word, that crossword, all orbiting some unseen center. I thought about Eleanor Fielding writing alone in her room, the slow bleed of ink through paper, the sound of the kettle clicking off. Perhaps she had loved the man in the photograph. Perhaps she had hated him. Most likely both. Oxford is full of such contradictions. Half affection, half regret, all bound together by intellect pretending to be indifference. Before leaving, I noticed a final page torn from the notebook. Its stub remained in the spine, ragged and uneven, as though removed in haste. On the inside cover, barely visible in the lamplight, a single initial had been impressed through pressure, not ink. M.I. closed the book. The room seemed to exhale. Or perhaps it was only me. Outside, rain began again against the window panes, tracing slow, deliberate lines down the glass. Lines of blue, if one cared to see them that way. There are certain kinds of men who live within Oxford as though they were carved into its architecture. Elegant, eroded by intellect, their sins polished smooth by conversation and tenure. Dr. Michael Garston was one of them. I met him in his office, a high-ceilinged room lined with books so cleanly ordered they seemed decorative rather than read. The air had that faint odor of varnish and lost arguments. He stood at the window as I entered, the late afternoon light cutting him in half. One side of his face in shadow, the other glowing faintly gold. He asked if it was about Eleanor. Not Miss Fielding, not the late Dr. Fielding. Simply Eleanor. The first deduction, though it hardly required genius. I said yes. He nodded as though it had been inevitable. Said she'd gone to London, lectures, friends, possibly Paris after that. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed. The sort of steadiness one hears in men who've had time to tidy their guilt into something defensible. I mentioned the letter we'd received. He smiled then. That peculiar English smile used to dismiss the seriousness of things. Said Oxford bred anonymous letters the way trees bred leaves. A sign of civic health, he called it. I noticed, as he spoke, a framed quotation above his desk. Hardy, naturally. The dead are ever among the living. Except it wasn't quite right. Hardy had written, "The dead are ever in the mind of the living." The omission of those two words shifted the meaning entirely. He had made the line more haunting, more ambiguous, and in that, more revealing of himself. His wife arrived halfway through our talk. Claire Garston, art historian, the sort of woman whose silence weighs more than most people's speech. She stood by the mantelpiece, the faintest smell of turpentine clinging to her coat. When I said her husband and Miss Fielding had worked closely, she replied that Oxford was a small place. The line of her mouth did not move, but the words had the precision of a scalpel. I asked when they had last seen Eleanor. Garston said 2 weeks ago. Claire said 10 days. A small difference, yet in such differences lies the first stir of truth. Lewis, who had been pretending to examine the bookshelves, found a train ticket on the sideboard. Paddington to Oxford, one way. Dated the same day Garston claimed she had left. I asked if he could explain it. He said it must have been hers, left behind. The phrase had an odd rhythm, the kind of offhand lie that people invent too quickly. We left soon after. Outside, the quadrangle was drowning in drizzle, the stones shining like wet bone. Lewis asked what I made of them. I said that Garston was the kind of man who would rather alter Hardy than admit error, and that Claire was the kind of woman who notices such alterations but pretends not to. He looked puzzled. I didn't blame him. Deduction, in my experience, is rarely about evidence. It is about tone. The timbre of voices, the weight of silences, the small tremors that betray the presence of something unsaid. Later that evening, I opened the crossword from the Times again, the one Eleanor had left half-finished. A clue near the bottom caught my attention. Poet's omission reveals heartless man. 7. The answer came easily. Elision, a word for what Garston had done. Removing meaning to preserve style. That night, I found myself thinking less about the case than about Claire's eyes when I mentioned Eleanor's name. There had been no jealousy there, only a kind of weary recognition, as if she had seen all this before. The pattern of men and women, intellect and longing, the university's endless capacity for polite ruin. I poured myself a whiskey and wrote the Hardy line correctly in my notebook. Then, beneath it, the version on Garston's wall. 2 small words missing, in the mind. Perhaps, I thought, that was the point. Perhaps Eleanor Fielding had never really left his mind, and that in the end might prove more dangerous than love itself. It was late when I brought the notebook home. I could have left it at the station in an evidence bag, filed neatly among the detritus of other half-finished lives. But something in it resisted bureaucracy. It had been written for 1 pair of eyes, perhaps 2, and I found myself unwilling to let it pass so coldly into record. The lamplight in my flat was too harsh, so I switched it off and read instead by the yellow pool from the desk lamp, the kind that turns paper into the color of old bone. The Latin filled the pages like a prayer learned too well. Tight, economical, the work of someone who loved precision more than beauty. And yet there was beauty in it, as there often is in restraint. Each margin was crowded with notes in that same bruised blue ink I'd come to recognize. Her words wove between the lines of Ovid as if she were arguing with him. At times she translated directly. At others she contradicted him, adding phrases of her own. One in particular lingered. To the lover absent, may truth not follow him? The irony was too deliberate to ignore. Lewis had left an unopened packet of biscuits on the desk before going home. He does that sometimes, as if kindness could disguise pity. I poured myself a whiskey instead and leaned back, the rain ticking against the window like a second hand on a clock. It was then that I saw the acrostic. I don't know how long it had been there, invisible to sense but waiting for sight. The first letters of each translated line, F-A-L-S-U-S. The Latin word for false. Coincidence, perhaps. But I've never trusted coincidence. It is the mask people put on when they wish to hide intention. On the final page, folded neatly, was a crossword from the Times. 2 weeks old. She had filled nearly all of it in, her handwriting disciplined, almost elegant. I scanned the grid idly until one clue caught me. Absent lover returns, concealing lie, 6. The answer she had left blank, but I knew it at once. Falsus, the same word, the same accusation. I thought of Garston then. The small corrections, the measured tone, the smile that hid fatigue and something like fear. A man who revised both his poetry and his life until neither bore the strain of truth. The crossword gave me an odd comfort. It felt like a message left in plain sight, a final conversation between a woman who could no longer speak and the man who might yet listen. I wondered whether she had sent it to him, folded in a letter, or left it somewhere she knew he'd find. Some part of me imagined her sitting in the pub that last evening, pen poised, wine untouched, the sound of rain against glass, blurring thought into decision. The whiskey had gone warm in my hand. I poured another and stared at the page. There were small impressions in the paper, letters written and erased, words too faint to read. I tilted the sheet toward the light until a few became legible. Not London. Not silence. The rest dissolved into the grain. Lewis phoned just after midnight to say the river patrol had found something near Folly Bridge. A woman's shoe. Size 6. Suede. Faint trace of blue ink on the inside heel. He sounded apologetic, as though he'd interrupted sleep I never expected to have. I told him to keep it for morning. When I hung up, I glanced again at the crossword. Its symmetry had begun to feel oppressive. Those black squares like sealed doors, the white ones awaiting confession. I filled in the last word carefully, the letters forming with quiet inevitability. Falsus. Outside, the city was almost silent, only the distant hum of the colleges settling into darkness. I closed the notebook and thought of Eleanor Fielding's hand pressing against the page, the ink bleeding through to the other side. Sometimes truth doesn't reveal itself in the answers we find, but in the words we leave unfinished. There is a certain stillness in Oxford's rivers at dawn, the kind that feels less like peace and more like hesitation, as though the city, for all its intellect and ritual, briefly forgets how to breathe. That morning, the air had that peculiar chill of early spring, the mist still clinging low to the water, and the voices of the rowers sounded too loud, too living. Lewis had called at 6:30. His tone was the one he reserves for unpleasant confirmations. "They've found her, sir, near Folly Bridge, caught in the weeds." By the time I reached the embankment, the mist had thinned, but not enough to disguise her shape under the tarpaulin. The police tape fluttered faintly, as though embarrassed to exist. The body lay just beyond reach of the current, turned slightly, as if she were still debating whether to drift or to rest. Eleanor Fielding. The river had done its quiet, ruinous work, smoothing the edges, dulling the details. But her face, even in that pale stillness, carried something of defiance. I thought of the notebooks, the blue ink, the lines written with the pressure of someone determined not to vanish. Lewis stood beside me, his breath visible in the air. He said she'd been in the water at least a week, maybe more. There was a handbag, too, wedged under a stone near the bank. Inside, a lipstick, a folded handkerchief, a key without a tag, and half a photograph. The missing half showed a man's shoulder and part of a smile. Garston's, perhaps. But guesses, like sympathy, are best kept quiet in the presence of the dead. The coroner muttered something about drowning, accidental most likely, though his voice carried the caution of a man unwilling to be contradicted. I noted the watch on her wrist. Stopped at 9:17. The time, I imagined, when truth had decided to end its shift. Lewis asked whether I believed it was suicide. He said it gently, without insistence. I told him I didn't know. Then, after a moment, that I never believed clever people drowned by accident. It's too ordinary a way to die. We walked along the towpath toward the bridge. The water lapped faintly against the pilings, the sound small and continuous, like breath caught in a dream. Near the edge, something glinted beneath the reeds. A small metal clasp, perhaps from her bag, though later I would remember it differently, as a suggestion rather than a fact. Back at the station, I spread the contents of the handbag across the desk. Each item seemed to resist interpretation, as if mocking the very notion of deduction. The lipstick, coral in shade, bore the faintest indentation of teeth. The handkerchief carried the scent of bergamot and river water, a strange, almost harmonious combination. The key was modern, its edges worn smooth by touch. Lewis mentioned a florist near the station who'd seen her 2 days before she disappeared. She'd bought a single white lily, no wrapping, and left without giving a name. He thought it meant something. I said everything means something, but seldom what we hope. That evening I returned to the river alone. The light was fading, that peculiar Oxford dusk that seems to last forever, as if the day cannot quite bring itself to end. I leaned against the rail and watched the ripples close over the spot where they'd found her. It occurred to me then that water, unlike people, never lies. It only reflects what it's given. A student passed by on a bicycle, humming without melody. From somewhere across the water came the faint toll of a chapel bell. Distant, reluctant, already forgotten. I thought of the notebook again, of the acrostic that spelled falsus, of the word written in blue that refused to fade. And I realized, though I could not yet explain it, that the key in her handbag did not belong to her rooms at Somerville. The teeth were too fine, the shape too deliberate. It was a key made for secrecy, not for home. The river, in its quiet way, had given her back, but it had kept her silence for itself. The Dean of Somerville was a woman who gave the impression that truth, like tea, should be served only when properly cooled. I remember her office as a place of low light and high shelves, the air thick with the smell of books and withheld sentiment. She poured the tea herself, slowly, as though it required moral deliberation. I'd come to ask about Eleanor Fielding, her absence, her work, the whisper of a complaint lodged and withdrawn. The dean nodded when I spoke the name, not with surprise, but with the subdued resignation of someone who has been expecting the question. Eleanor had accused Dr. Garston of plagiarism. The charge had reached her desk in a neatly folded letter, accompanied by a single page of Latin translation and a note in blue ink. She said the handwriting was unmistakable, even before the signature. Then, 1 week later, another letter, this time from Eleanor herself, rescinding the claim. No explanation, no apology, only a sentence. I was mistaken. Please forget this matter. She said she'd tried. There was a pause then, the kind that fills a room like mist. The dean stirred her tea without drinking it, the spoon tracing soft circles that seemed to mark the limits of her conscience. I noticed her eyes shift toward the window each time Garston's name was mentioned, as if she feared that even the ivy clinging to the college walls might overhear. I asked if she believed Eleanor had been mistaken. No, she said quietly. I believe she had been persuaded. It was the word persuaded that caught me. The balance of it, neither force nor consent, a word belonging to those grey areas where truth and courtesy coexist uncomfortably. She handed me the translation that had accompanied the accusation. I recognized the familiar, bruised blue ink immediately. The passage was from Ovid again, Heroides, the letter from Penelope to Ulysses. The final line underlined twice. What use is fidelity when truth itself is faithless? Lewis would have said it was all circumstantial, and he would have been right, but Oxford lives on circumstance. Small gestures, footnotes, hesitations. Its crimes are rarely born of violence. They begin instead with sentences that should never have been written. When I asked if she had spoken to Garston after the accusation, the dean smiled faintly, though there was no humour in it. He came to assure me of his innocence, she said. He was charming. Most guilty men are. I asked if Eleanor had seemed frightened before she vanished. Not frightened, she said. Tired. As if she'd been carrying a truth too heavy for one person. Then she added, after a long silence, that Eleanor had once told her she admired Garston's mind, but not his heart. That she pitied his wife, that she feared being the cause of someone else's silence. It was the kind of remark people dismiss in conversation, but remember later, when remembrance is all that's left. Before leaving, I asked if Eleanor's rooms had been searched. The dean hesitated, then reached for her keys. She said she had entered once, 2 days after Eleanor failed to appear for her lecture. There had been nothing unusual, except a book left open on the desk. Ovid's Metamorphoses, page marked by a blue ribbon. The story of Echo, the nymph who could only repeat the words of others. On my way out, she stopped me with a question of her own. Do you think, Inspector, that Oxford forgives its sins too easily? I told her forgiveness was not the problem. Forgetfulness was. Later, in the quadrangle, I watched the rain trickle down the chapel steps and thought about Echo, condemned to repeat what others said, until her voice faded into stone. Perhaps that was what Eleanor feared most. Not death, but the slow petrification of truth beneath layers of polite silence. The translation lay folded in my pocket. Its ink had begun to smudge from the rain, the blue spreading into the paper like something trying to escape. The wine arrived before the truth did. It often does. Lewis had called that morning to say the lab report on the bottles found at the Garstons' house had come back. A Chianti delivery, 3 cases, ordered under Claire Garston's account, but signed for by her husband. 1 bottle opened, 2 missing. A domestic arithmetic that rarely adds up cleanly. The bottles were lined on the evidence table like witnesses refusing to speak. I turned one in my hand. The label had been peeled slightly at the corner, enough to expose the faint impression of a thumb. Not Garston's. Too small, too careful. Lewis said the ink traces were odd. Blue, faint but present around the neck of the open bottle. The same shade, perhaps, as Eleanor Fielding's pen. He thought it meant something. I told him it meant everything, or nothing, depending on who held the bottle last. We drove out to the Garstons that afternoon. The rain had slackened into that dull, indecisive drizzle that makes Oxford seem half-dreamt. Claire opened the door before we knocked. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the fatigue of someone rehearsing composure too often. She invited us in, as though it were a formality she could no longer avoid. The sitting room smelled faintly of varnish and wine corks. A painting on the easel, unfinished, caught my eye. A study of a glass half full, its reflection fractured by the brush's impatience. I told her about the bottles. She said she'd ordered them for an exhibition opening, though the opening had been postponed. When I asked who had chosen the Chianti, she said Michael had. He liked its melancholy color. I made a note of the phrasing. The detail of taste always betrays more than confession. Lewis, ever the diplomat, asked whether she knew Eleanor. Claire smiled thinly. Everyone in Oxford knows everyone, she said, though her tone suggested she regretted the fact. On the mantel stood 2 glasses, one spotless, one with the faint rim of lipstick. I touched it lightly. The glass trembled, and I thought, for a moment, that the vibration resembled a sigh. When I asked whether Eleanor had ever been in the house, Claire didn't answer. Instead, she poured herself a measure of wine from an open bottle on the tray. The same Chianti. She offered some to me. I declined. She said Michael had taught her to appreciate bitterness. Lewis glanced at me. The bottle was already half empty. I asked when she'd last seen her husband. She said he was away lecturing in London. Then, almost as an afterthought, that he had taken the car Eleanor once borrowed. The smallest of hesitations followed the word borrowed. Before leaving, I noticed a pen on the sideboard. Blue ink, same brand as the one found with Eleanor's notebook. I asked if it was hers. Claire looked at it for a moment as though unsure. Perhaps, she said. I've lent it out before. To friends. That evening I stopped by the King's Arms again. Biddle had the place nearly empty. He asked if I'd heard about the woman in the river. I said I had. He poured me a scotch and said Garston had been in the night before last. Quiet, polite, alone. He'd ordered a glass of wine but left before drinking it. I asked which kind. Biddle frowned. Chianti, I think. When I got home, I opened Eleanor's notebook once more. A faint stain marked one page. Reddish-brown, spreading across a translation of Ovid. Not ink, not water. I touched the paper, smelled faintly of tannin and thyme. Wine has a way of keeping its secrets longer than people do. The next morning, the lab confirmed it. The blue trace around the Chianti's neck wasn't from a pen at all. It was dye, the kind found on certain kinds of art brushes. Claire's brushes, the ink-stained bottle, the missing wine, the careful wife. A red herring, then. But red herrings, like certain wines, often lead to the true taste beneath the cork. There are moments when beauty becomes a form of cruelty, when what is rendered in stillness exposes more truth than motion ever could. Claire Garston's portrait was like that. I saw it the following afternoon in the narrow studio above the High Street. The light there was reluctant, filtered through gauze curtains, the smell of turpentine hanging in the air like the residue of some moral solvent. She stood beside the easel, the hem of her sleeve stained faintly with pigment. The painting leaned against the wall, not displayed but waiting, as though even she wasn't sure whether it should be seen. It was Eleanor, or rather an approximation of her, the sort of likeness that carries more memory than accuracy. The figure faced away, head slightly turned, a glass raised in one hand, her hair coiled in a way that suggested both restraint and defiance. The background was darker, a blurred room that hinted at reflection, and within that reflection, barely perceptible, the faint outline of a man's face in a window pane. I asked if she'd painted it before or after Eleanor's death. She said before, though she couldn't remember precisely when. Time, she said, blurs when one paints people who disturb it. Her tone was quiet, not evasive, but careful, as if words themselves had become inflammable. Lewis stood awkwardly near the door, trying not to breathe the paint fumes. He asked why the portrait hadn't been exhibited. Claire said it wasn't meant to be seen, then, almost absently, that it had started as a study in absence, how to capture someone not present. how to fill space with what used to be there. It was then that I noticed the palette on the table beside her, a smear of deep red, almost black where it thickened, and beside it, a streak of blue, the same bruised shade as the ink in Eleanor's notebooks. I asked if she mixed her own colors. She said yes, always. I thought of the report about the Chianti bottles, the trace of blue dye, and said nothing. On the wall hung another canvas, turned to face inward. I asked what it was. She hesitated, then said it was unfinished. Something her husband disliked. She'd begun it the week Eleanor vanished. A landscape, perhaps, though she seemed unwilling to describe it further. When Lewis stepped out to take a call, I asked her directly whether she had known about Michael's affair. She didn't flinch. She said knowing and acknowledging are not the same thing, and that Oxford wives, like Oxford buildings, are often admired for the elegance of their facades. Then, with a trace of bitterness, she added that truth is a terrible decorator. She looked at the portrait again, and her voice softened. Eleanor was clever, she said, but she confused admiration for affection. They all do in the end. The men, the students, the wives. It's a university of mistaken meanings. There was a small pause, filled only by the sound of rain beginning to tap against the skylight. I moved closer to the painting. The brushwork was deliberate, disciplined, but around the figure's hand, the one holding the glass, the paint had been disturbed, as if wiped and repainted several times. I could almost imagine her trying to decide whether to make the glass full or empty. Before leaving, I asked about the reflection in the window, the shadowed man. She smiled faintly, though her eyes did not follow the smile. Every artist paints a ghost eventually, she said. Sometimes it's the sitter, sometimes it's the painter. That evening, back in my flat, I wrote the name Claire Garston at the top of a page and drew a small sketch beneath, the outline of a woman raising a toast to no one. Then I wrote a line from the crossword that had been sitting unsolved for days. Artist conceals. Truth in reflection. 6. The answer came slowly, but with a kind of inevitability. Mirror. I closed the notebook. Outside, the rain had turned heavier, blurring the city lights into uncertain colors. In that soft distortion, everything looked painted, the streets, the windows, even the river itself. Oxford, I thought, was full of portraits that pretended to be reflections, and sometimes it was impossible to tell which was which. He lived at the far edge of North Oxford, in one of those houses that seem designed to discourage visitors. High hedges, a gravel path too neatly raked, the faint smell of mothballs and regret. Professor Adrian Vane, the last of the Latinists who still believed knowledge could atone for anything. He greeted me with that dry civility particular to academics who have outlived both their relevance and their rivals. His hands trembled slightly as he gestured me inside. The house was lined with books, spines fading like old uniforms, dust settling where conversation no longer reached. I told him I was there about Eleanor Fielding. The name hung for a moment, then seemed to settle somewhere behind his eyes. He said he remembered her well, a brilliant student, though prone to intensity, as if scholarship were a form of devotion. He poured tea from a chipped pot, the sound uneven, like rain beginning to falter. I asked if they had worked closely. He said they had, once, though the phrasing was careful. She had written her dissertation under his supervision before moving into teaching. He spoke of her translations, Ovid, Propertius, and how she had a tendency to make the Roman poets sound too personal, as if she were translating herself. He said she had come to see him some weeks before she disappeared. She'd been upset, though not frightened. Angry, perhaps. About Garston, about something she claimed he'd stolen. The word stolen pressed itself between us. I asked if he knew what she meant. He hesitated, stirring his tea long after the sugar had dissolved. Then he said he suspected she'd discovered something in Garston's forthcoming book, a passage she claimed as her own translation, though, of course, he added, there are only so many ways to render Ovid into English. I noted the defensive rhythm, the unnecessary elaboration. Scholars rarely lie without ornament. I asked whether he had helped Garston with the book. He smiled, faintly, the kind of smile that seeks refuge in its own irony. They had, he admitted, collaborated in a limited capacity, old colleagues helping each other, as it were. He had provided a few references, some unpublished notes. I said Eleanor had written falsus repeatedly in her notebook. He looked genuinely startled, though he recovered quickly. He said the word might refer to Ovid's Fasti, Book 2, a meditation on deceit. Then he quoted from memory, softly, as if reciting confession. Falsus amor miseros multos fecisse putatur. False love, they say, has made many wretched. Lewis would have missed it, but I caught the shift. Not in tone, but in the way his hand tightened around the teacup. Quotation as camouflage. He said he had written Eleanor a letter after her death. I asked if I might see it. He refused politely, then, seeing my expression, relented. The letter was short, only a few lines. But at the bottom, in the same bruised blue ink as her notebook, was her name. Not written, but traced. As I left, I noticed the study door slightly ajar. Inside, a desk cluttered with manuscripts. On top, a single page torn from a notebook. I recognized the neat, looping handwriting. Latin on one side, English on the other. Her work. I did not take it, only memorized the translation before leaving. He who stole words will lose silence. Outside, the evening had folded itself into a dull mist. The lamps along Banbury Road glowed faintly, blurred by rain. I stood for a while under one of them, listening to the sound of my own breath, wondering whether the professor's silence was the product of guilt or of habit. In Oxford, the two are often indistinguishable. That night, as I copied the quotation into my notes, I realized the acrostic formed by her last translation spelled something more deliberate than falsus. It spelled vain, and for the first time in weeks, the case began to make sense, though, as always, too late for comfort. The King's Arms looked different that evening. Not changed exactly. Places like that never truly change. But quieter, as though it had finally grown weary of overhearing human frailty. The board above the bar still bore the same phrase, chalked in a tired hand, a toast to the absent lover. The chalk had faded, though, half erased by weeks of smoke and damp. Biddle greeted me with a nod that carried both recognition and caution. He asked if we'd finished with all that business by the river. I said not quite. He said he wasn't surprised. Oxford, in his experience, preferred its mysteries half solved. I sat at the same table where Eleanor Fielding had once sat, the same corner near the window, the same low hum of conversation just beyond hearing. On the table stood 2 empty glasses. I hadn't ordered yet, but somehow it seemed appropriate that the place had anticipated company. Garston had been here the night she died. Biddle remembered it now with a kind of clarity that comes to men when they sense the moment has become a story. Around 9:15, he said, Garston came in alone. Sat right there, where you're sitting now. Ordered a Chianti. Spoke to no one. Drank a little, maybe half a glass. Then left. Didn't take his umbrella. Funny thing that. Raining cats and dogs it was. 9:15. Her watch had stopped at 9:17. I looked around the room. Nothing remarkable. The smell of damp coats, the faint tang of beer lines not properly cleaned, and yet the air felt taut, as if holding its breath in sympathy with memory. When I asked whether Garston had seemed agitated, Biddle thought for a moment. Not agitated exactly. Thoughtful. The kind of man who might be planning a speech or rehearsing an apology. He'd raised his glass once, halfway as though toasting someone unseen. A toast to the absent lover. It was not sentiment that struck me then, but sequence. He'd been here, left at 9:15, walked perhaps 15 minutes to the river, the same river where she was found. Her handbag contained the key to Vane's study, not her own. The acrostic in her notebook, the falsus, the stolen words. Garston had gone to destroy something, or someone. When I returned to the car, Lewis was waiting. He'd been to Vane's house with the warrant. They'd found the missing notebook page tucked inside a copy of the Heroides on Vane's desk. The handwriting was Eleanor's, the translation precise, but beneath it, in another hand, a correction, a change of tense, a single word altered. Vane's hand, unmistakable. The theft had been small, but total. She had discovered it, of course, and Garston, loyal, fearful, Vane, had agreed to silence her to protect them both. It should have felt like resolution, but it didn't. I've never believed in tidy endings. Later, at the station, Garston confessed. Not dramatically. He simply said she had wanted to meet by the river, that they argued, that she slipped. He'd panicked, carried her to the water's edge, watched the current take her. The glass in the pub, the toast, the umbrella, all part of the theatre of cowardice that follows sudden guilt. I drove home through the drizzle, the city lights bleeding into the wet pavements. When I poured myself a whiskey, the first sip tasted faintly of iron. The rain against the window sounded almost rhythmic, like a pen pressing too hard against paper. Before bed, I opened my notebook and wrote a final line. Truth is not the opposite of falsehood. It is its reflection. I thought of Eleanor, the woman who wrote in blue ink, who translated herself into silence, and of Garston, who had turned her absence into metaphor. Then I thought, unwillingly, of Claire, who had painted her own grief into permanence. I finished the glass, let the silence grow heavy, and whispered the words Biddle had chalked so long ago. A toast to the absent lover. The words lingered, faintly bitter, like the last trace of wine at the bottom of a forgotten glass. There is a certain hour in Oxford when the day forgets to continue. It's not quite dusk, not yet night, but something quieter in between, a suspension of consequence. That evening, the city felt emptied of sound. Even the bells seemed reluctant to strike. Garston had confessed that morning. I'd watched him fold his hands on the table like a man offering proof of manners rather than guilt. He spoke in the same tone he used in lectures, I imagine. Clipped, rhythmic, almost beautiful in its self-pity. He said she had fallen, that she had turned from him. Mid-sentence, that the bank was wet. I could have believed him, perhaps, had it not been for the small detail of the umbrella. He had left it in the pub. Guilt leaves traces in the trivial, the uncollected coat, the unsent letter, the unwashed glass. I have built a life's work from noticing what others are kind enough to overlook. After the paperwork, the photographs, the low tones of procedural closure, Lewis drove me home. He talked of dinner, of quiet weekends, of the rare pleasure of nothing to do. I told him he deserved it, though I didn't mean it. Men like Lewis still believed rest was something earned. Men like me had long since stopped believing it was permitted. When he left, I poured myself a whiskey and put on Mozart. The slow movement of the piano concerto in E minor, one of those fragments that never quite resolves. It seemed the only fitting music for endings that weren't. Eleanor Fielding's notebook lay open on the table. The ink had faded to a pale violet under the lamplight. I traced one of her lines with my finger. To the lover absent. May truth not follow him. The kind of line written by someone who had known too much of both. The case was finished in every measurable sense. Vane had resigned quietly. Garston awaited sentencing. Claire had retreated behind the serenity of the unspoken. Oxford, as always, had exhaled and continued, its ancient heart indifferent to the small tragedies of those who lived within it. Yet something lingered, a dissonance, faint but persistent. Perhaps it was the photograph found in her bag, the torn half showing Garston smiling toward someone just beyond the frame. Or perhaps it was the key that had never fitted any of her locks. Secrets, like music, rely on timing. Some arrive too late to be of use. I thought of her handwriting again, the way she pressed too hard, as though language were the only weapon left to her. Of her translation of Ovid, of the acrostic that had spelled falsus. False, a word that had accused everyone and no one in equal measure. Outside, rain began to fall, a thin, patient rhythm against the glass. The same rain that had erased her footprints by the river. I poured another drink and wondered, as I too often do, whether knowledge ever redeems what it destroys. I have always preferred the minor keys. They do not lie. They suggest what cannot be resolved and leave the listener to live with what remains. When the record ended, I didn't lift the needle. The silence that followed seemed honest enough. I thought of Eleanor, not as victim or scholar or lover, but as a woman who had wanted her absence to mean something, and I wondered whether, in some cruel way, it finally did. Before turning out the light, I wrote one last entry in my notebook. Not for the file, but for myself. We learn nothing from death but timing. The rest is translation. Then I closed the book, finished the glass, and let the music resume in memory. A coda in E minor, trailing into the dark like the sound of rain on the river that keeps all secrets eventually.